Good evening. I'm Zinat Rahman, the new Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. Welcome, special welcome to the first years and the second years who are first years to our public speaker series. Today's panel is How 9/11 Changed America and the World. And for some of you in the audience, you weren't probably born when 9/11 happened, but for those of us who were, you will never forget where you were and what you were doing when the towers came down. And we thought that it was really important to do a panel 20 years on, looking at the massive downstream effects that 9/11 had, on our politics, on our foreign policy, on communities across our country, on our social division. And we have experts here, an all-star panel that is going to discuss that with us. So one of our students, Brian, is going to formally introduce our panel in a few minutes. I want to give you guys some spoiler alerts about upcoming events. So tomorrow, Tuesday, October 5th, David Axelrod, who's our director, our founding director, will be moderating a conversation with Washington Post political reporter Robert Costa. That's also going to be a live taping of the Axe Files. Robert is a former IOP fellow. He's a co-author with Bob Woodward of the new book Peril, which examines the tumultuous period and the transfer of power between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So you can go to our website, sign up for that. On Friday, join us for lunch at the IOP House, where I will be interviewing Lauren Baer, who is a nationally recognized civic leader, who will share her personal story of running for Congress and serving as a senior advisor in the State Department. This event is going to be hosted in partnership with the Spectrum LGBTQ+ Alliance, which is a student-led civic engagement program at the Institute of Politics. After the moderated discussion tonight, we'll open the floor to take questions from you in the audience, so please line up to ask your questions. And remember, everyone's welcome at the microphone. Please keep your mask on when you ask your question. Please leave room for a diversity of viewpoints in terms of who's asking those questions. And as usual, also, we'll give priority to the first questions to be asked by our student audience. Make sure your phones are on silent, the bathrooms are downstairs, and we'll now hear formal introductions of our panelists and moderator from Brian Cronin. Brian is from Griffin, Georgia. He's a second-year student at the Harris School of Public Policy. He's also a graduate chair with the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Board. So please join me in welcoming Brian to the podium.
Hey everyone, good evening. My name is Brian Cronin, and I'm a second-year Master's of Public Policy student here at the university. And I currently serve as a grad chair on the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Board. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming you to tonight's event, How 9/11 Changed America and the World. Last month, we collectively paused and reflected on how the world and America have changed 20 years after the terrorist attack on America. And as future generations become further removed from September 11, 2001, it is important to study how this day of infamy forever changed the world. There are few people who are as well suited as our guests this evening to discuss how life shifted after 9/11. Moderating tonight's event is New York Times bestselling author Evan Osnos. His book, Wildland, The Making of America's Fury, is for sale over here. Joining him is Farah Pandith, Senior Fellow, Future of Diplomacy Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. We also have Michael Morrell, former Acting and Deputy Director for the CIA, and member of the IOP's Board of Advisors. And lastly, we have Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, and author of the new book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made, and that also is for sale over here. And with that, thank you again for coming tonight, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guests.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. This is an event I've been looking forward to for a long time. We have all of us, I think, in one way or another, been thinking about, over the last few weeks, the legacy of 9/11. As we heard in the introduction, some of you in this room were not born then. And for others in this room, it has been one of the defining facts of our adult lives. A fact that dates us, I'm afraid, but there you are. So now the secrets have been revealed. There was a very prescient comment, it was 20 years ago, that the now late historian Tony Judd said, "From my window in lower Manhattan, I watched the 21st century begin." I think that's even truer than it was when he said it. We now have a deeper sense in political terms, economic terms, technology, and of course culture and American values. That was the period of a new phase in American life, and we're still reckoning with what that is. And it's an active, ongoing process. It's something we're all contending with in our own ways. Very briefly, we're going to turn to our panelists in a second for a number of different perspectives. Everybody up here has had a key piece of the last 20 years and has experienced it in as personal terms as you can imagine. In my own limited experience, I was a reporter in New York on 9/11. I ended up going overseas for a decade afterwards. First, I went over to cover the war in Iraq, and then it was in China, and eventually came back to the US. And when I came back, it was 2013, and I will tell you what struck me was the way in which 9/11 had become this almost unique symbolic instrument in our politics. It was almost on its own level in terms of the power it contained, both positively and negatively. And I was struck, I remember reading a survey in which Americans were asked to estimate what percentage of the population we thought was Muslim. And the average estimate that people gave in reply to that question was 1 in 6. And the actual number is 1 in 100. So there was a way in which the years after 9/11 had played tricks on our perceptions of ourselves and of the outside world. And I think we're still beginning to unravel the consequences of that. So what we're going to talk about tonight is things like, what did 9/11 mean for our politics here at home, and also for some of the big geopolitical questions around the world? What did it mean to communities of color? What was the experience of Islamophobia in the United States, and how did that refract through people's lives? What did it mean in national security terms? How did it change how we defend ourselves as a country, and how do we go after people who seek to do us harm abroad? And then finally, of course, what does it teach us about extremism and radicalism in this country? What is it that we can draw the lessons of 9/11 perhaps in helping us understand this moment today in which we find ourselves contending with homegrown radicalism of a very different kind, the kind we saw on January 6th at the Capitol. So I want to start, if I can, by turning to each of our panelists and just give us a sense, if you would, please, Michael, starting with you, of where you were on that day. What job were you doing? What work were you doing? How did that moment begin to change your sense of this country? Essentially, I'm asking, when did you realize, and it may not have been on 9/11, but when did you realize in the weeks or months or whatever it was afterwards that we were at the cusp of some serious transformations in the years ahead?
So it's great to be here. I love the University of Chicago. I love the Institute of Politics. My 3 kids went to UChicago. 2 of them were involved in IOP, one deeply. So it's a real honor to be here. So I think some people know that I was with President Bush on 9/11. I was his daily intelligence briefer from January 4th, 2001 to January 4th, 2002. I went with him wherever he was in the world. I briefed him 6 days a week. So I was with him when Air Force One went wheels up on September 10th for what was to be a quick trip to Florida for a political event. So I was with him when all this happened. I was with him all day. We had a number of interactions. And there were a number of surreal moments that day. No surprise, right? But I don't think, people ask me all the time, did you know the world changed that day? And I didn't, because I was so busy doing my job. I was so busy conveying intelligence to him and answering his questions and sending his questions back to CIA and trying to get them answered. And so it didn't really hit me until the following Saturday, when he held a meeting at Camp David with his national security team, where essentially he decided at that meeting to go to war. He made the formal decision on Sunday, but you could tell by his reaction to the briefings he got that day that we were going to war. And I think that's when it hit me that this was going to change everything.
And at that point, the parameters of the war, as you understood it, were a specific war in Afghanistan, or how broadly did you imagine
the parameters of the war were troops on the ground a limited number of troops on the ground in Afghanistan for counterterrorism purposes only, right? The shift to changing Afghan society and Afghan politics came in early 2002. And a rest of the world intelligence push against al-Qaeda cells that were in various places around the planet. But the military intervention in Afghanistan was to be quite limited. And at the end of the day you're talking about no more than 110 CIA officers and about 300 special forces officers destroyed the Taliban and drove al-Qaeda out of the country.
If somebody had told you then that we would be in Afghanistan for 20 years, what would you have said?
I would not have believed them.
Why?
Because we had defeated them, right? And we had met the president's objective. And so I didn't, in late December, I didn't know what was left, right? And it wasn't until the policy was changed to take this feudal, tribal, decentralized system, right, and turn it into a liberal democracy that had centralized power, right? And it's never had it in its history. And I thought, if you had asked me at that moment, is that objective achievable? I think I probably would have said yes, looking at, thinking about some other examples in history. But I think where it hit me that the answer to that question was no, was after the Obama surge, when we had 130,000 troops in the country and NATO had another couple of tens of thousands, and the Taliban fought us to a stalemate. I knew at that moment that there's no way we can win this war. And I think President Obama knew, and I think he,
For sure.
When we had meeting after meeting after meeting on what the stay behind force was going to be, I knew that the president wanted the answer to be zero.
Far, you were working for the Bush administration at that point. Where were you, or what were you doing at the time? What was your job, and when did you have your moment of realization?
Well, I would like to also just say thank you to the Institute of Politics for having me. It's a joy to be back on this campus. And I really want to commend both Zinat and David for having the courage to talk about a really complex and really important subject. I was working in Boston. I was vice president of international business for a consulting affiliate of a law firm on 9/11. The night before, our firm and others had hosted Senator John Kerry and Senator John McCain in Boston for the Christian Herter Award, which they had both received for their service in Vietnam. We had had a wonderful evening. It was at the Copley in Boston. Everybody was really happy. I was in a great mood on September 11th. The thing went off really well. And when I arrived at work on a perfect sunny day, I was on the 41st floor of a building that overlooked Logan Airport. And we had just begun to see the news of, we couldn't figure it out. We didn't know what was really going on. But the news was reporting that something fishy had happened at Logan. And as things progressed, we obviously learned that people boarded a plane from there, something else was going on. And I remember distinctly looking out through the window at Logan with my heart sinking, and I remember thinking, I hope to God this has nothing to do with Islam. And in the days afterward, obviously, I had heard about al-Qaeda because of the USS Cole. I had studied extremism in graduate school. I had studied radicalization in graduate school. I did my master's thesis on the insurgency in Kashmir, where I interviewed militants on the ground there. 2 of my relatives had been assassinated there. I was familiar with radicalization, but the power of ideology, of what can happen. And so I knew AQ, I knew the group. But what happened in the days afterwards, when they took responsibility and they unleashed this idea that they were going to define our country, America, I had a visceral reaction. I was an American, I was a Muslim, I was madder than hell. Who were they to tell me what my country was? Who were they to say that America was at war with Islam? Who were they to tell me how to be a Muslim? I was furious. And I walked into my boss's office and I said, Steve, I love it here. Boston is home. My family is here. I grew up here. I have to serve. I don't care what I do. I don't care where you put me. You have to help me. I don't come from a political family. I don't have any connections. And the firm that I worked for was extraordinary. It was a law firm that was founded by Jewish lawyers who couldn't find a home in Boston because of the Boston Brahmin mentality. And they came to my side, the Democrats and the Republicans. It was a very political firm. And they said, Farah wants to go to Washington. What do we do? And they began to rally. And it took some time, but I got back into government because of 9/11. Not realizing that I would be there as long as I was, but it was for me this idea of the narrative that Al-Qaeda was trying to push out to the world, that this is who America was, and that this is how you had to be a proper Muslim.
And when you went back into government, what were the parameters of your project? What did you think you could achieve, and did you achieve it?
One of the things Mike said, which was really important, we had a very specific focus. We were trying to eradicate the appeal of AQ. We also were trying to very clearly demolish this narrative of us versus them that Al-Qaeda had put out there. That's from the time, very soon after 9/11, there was a kinetic component of the war. How do we go after bin Laden? I wasn't involved in that, obviously. What they asked me to do was to think about what can we do to build resilience within communities and break down that narrative? I began to do that. I had a very narrow focus, and I was working at the U.S. Agency for International Development, which works at the grassroots level. I mean, that's where we do our work. So I began my work in thinking through how communities, how grassroots could make a difference. In 2004, they asked me to go to Kabul, and I was there for some time, where I was very fortunate to be able to see our work on the ground, but it was very clear to me that big pieces were missing in our understanding and our analysis of what was taking place, the cultural component most importantly. And Mike was very, on the point when he said, it's complex.
Yep.
These aren't easy things to do. And I think for me, having been born in that part of the world, having understood just over the Himalayas, which is where I was born, how complex it is and how identity and belonging and religion play out, we can't be sitting in Washington try to understand the impact of all of these things on communities on the ground.
Ben, in some ways, I suppose your life was transformed more than any of the people on this stage. You were living a very different life before 9/11. What happened?
Yeah, I was working for Diana Rayner for City Council in Bushwick, Brooklyn on 9/11. So, I've thought about this a lot, and in this book, I try to unpack what really jumps out to me about that day and kind of where we've gone, which hopefully kind of leads into where we're going here. But I was 23 years old. I was a graduate student in creative writing, which in retrospect was not good for my career in politics.
Maybe we're just thinking about it the wrong way. You can take creative writing and politics in other direction.
I know, maybe I was innovating. And so I was working part-time jobs, and I was working on the city council campaign, and it was election day. And so I was not much older than the students here, trying to figure out what I'm doing with myself. Do I want to go into politics? Do I want to be a writer? Do I want to be a journalist? And I'm handing out flyers at a polling site, and it's right on the waterfront, and the Brooklyn waterfront. And suddenly we look up, and there's this black smoke billowing out of the World Trade Center. And this kind of small group of people gathers with me, the person who's doing my job for the rival campaign, and like the cop who was like there to watch, make sure nothing goes wrong. And maybe a couple other people just hanging around, real Brooklyn, New York scene. And while we're looking at this, we see a plane come and make a perfect turn directly into the World Trade Center. And just imagine you're just watching that.
Wow.
And before that, we'd heard from the cops' radio, like, well, maybe it's a small plane that was an accident. But when you see that, okay, there's something very consequential is happening. And then we just kind of are staring at this scene for a time, not knowing what to say. And then we see the first tower collapse. And and I did know my life had just changed completely. Because first of all, I thought like 50,000 people had just been killed in front of me. It didn't occur to me that that wouldn't wipe out Lower Manhattan, where I knew a lot of people because I was a New Yorker. There were no cell phones because the cell phone service ran through the World Trade Center. So you had no information. We're just standing there in the street. And then there are these interactions that always stuck in my mind in a weird way. I see them as kind of, at the time I didn't, but when I look back, I see them as these kind of weird indicators of where we were going. So the first thing I remember is this cop who's younger than I am now, I mean, a young guy assigned to watch a polling site. He gets like a total recall. He was our only source of information. He's like, I gotta go. They're saying every single cop and firefighter just go to ground zero. And so he gets in the car and just disappears. And to me, he's like everybody that we ended up throwing at this. Everybody got deployed multiple times to Iraq and Afghanistan. I have no idea what happened to that guy, but just, told go, Then I'm kind of wandering, because I have no idea what to do with myself. There's clearly not going to be an election. I remember this guy comes up to me in this kind of classic New York thing. This old guy, he grabs my wrist and he starts yelling in a really thick European accent. This is sabotage, 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 and over and over and over again. And it's weird, even at the time, it's like, it felt like a warning, Not like an assignment of blame, but of like, don't fall for it. It felt like that's what he was communicating in some strange way. And so then I'm wandering, I run into a friend of mine from this graduate program that I was in, a poet, who has no idea what's happening, so I have to tell her. We go to her apartment. And again, there was no social media, which is interesting to think about how that event would have been different, because people just started to gather at her apartment and are like hugging each other and really connecting as human beings, not like sitting home alone, like scrolling. But no idea what this meant for our lives, And to me, she and I, frankly, at that time, kind of reflected kind of young, liberal Americans who just lived through this relatively trivial decade of the 90s. And it was like, something just blew up our world. Not sure what my place is in it now, And that was kind of the feeling I got in that room. So then I leave there because I kind of wanted to be by myself, and I walk down Bedford Avenue, which is like the heart of, then hipster Brooklyn. Right now it's like, moved way out. But, and I'll never forget, there was this guy who had like a muscle shirt on and like a big truck, and he parked it on the street, and everybody's out in the street because they're not in their homes looking at screens, and he was blasting Howard Stern. And kind of glaring at us, you hipster Brooklyn liberals, And Howard Stern is just talking about Palestinians or celebrating the street, and we're gonna go bomb them, we're gonna go bomb everybody. And that to me was like the beginning of Trump. It was like this vein of like, this isn't just about getting people overseas. It's about you guys, like showing you guys, like you guys are, like you don't understand what the world really is, and we gotta go handle this. And then the last thing I remember is walking over this bridge from Brooklyn to Queens and seeing this guy at a tripod, like that, with a camera on it, just taking picture after picture after picture of Ground Zero. And I remember thinking, well, this is kind of ghoulish. And also it's weird, nobody had a cell phone, right? So I have no pictures of that day, But to me, that's like the American media. Like, we cannot look away from this thing. This is exciting in a way, as horrible as that sounds, right? And so I know I'm taking a lot of liberty, but like I knew my life had changed. I didn't know how. I went to an Army recruiter the next day. I was in a very strange frame of mind. But I knew I wanted to be a part of whatever, whatever the response to this was, I'm going to plug my life into that.
It's an amazing fact that 9/11 was, in a sense, the last human event before the advent of cell phone and everything that's come with it. There's a factoid that there's only 3 known recordings of the first plane going into the towers. And since then, that image has been viewed, they estimate, by 2/3 of humanity. And the images, that, you remember in New York City, those missing posters that were everywhere. What's fascinating to look at them now was that was before the age of the selfie. So these were photos that had been cut out of wedding pictures and family reunions. We hadn't yet sort of changed our whole frame of reference in some sense to the experience of
Just quick on that, it was the last event and it was really traumatic. The place,
Yeah.
New York, Lower Manhattan was like a war zone. You could smell the acrid smell in the air. There were those photos everywhere, and everybody was out. Everybody somehow was out of their homes, just walking around New York. It was unlike anything I've ever experienced.
Mike, you then spent much of the next 2 decades thinking about the national security implications for this country. And of all the ways in which we were affected, national security was the most immediate transformation. I think you said something interesting recently that caught my attention, where you said that if bin Laden was alive today, how would he see the world? How would he see the movement that he started? And you said he'd be pretty happy with where the movement stands. And at the same time, you point out, the United States was not hit with another terrorist attack after 9/11. Help us understand these two, in some ways, contrasting characterizations of where we are.
Yeah, so I always thought it was a great question to ask, how would he view things? And some journalists finally asked, and I had an opportunity to answer it. But one of the
Wait
jobs,
long enough, you'll find one eventually, Mike.
one of the jobs of an intelligence officer is to give the president the other guy's perspective. Right? So how does Vladimir Putin see the world? How does Kim Jong-un see the world? Right? When you understand that Kim Jong-un believes that the United States wants to invade North Korea and replace him and his regime, then you understand his desire for nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent against that, right? If you understand that Vladimir Putin believes that the United States is trying to play in his politics and get rid of him and have his people rise up against him, right, then it puts 2016 in perspective, right? He thinks he's just responding to what we're doing to him, which we're not, by the way. So I thought it was important to say, okay, how would bin Laden see things, right? He started this. So I think there'd be two sides to the coin for him, right? On one side of the coin would be he never got a chance to conduct a second successful attack here, despite multiple plans to do so and efforts to do so. So a loss for him, right? He didn't succeed in driving. Well, maybe this is still debatable, right? He didn't succeed in the short term in driving the United States out of the Middle East. We can come back and talk about that, right? And he certainly didn't succeed in overthrowing Sunni Arab regimes and replacing them with Islamic governments, right? So he's the loser on that. But I think on the other side of the coin for him is on September 10th, 2001, there were a few al-Qaeda cells around the world, but they were very small. And probably in Afghanistan, there were at most 500 al-Qaeda guys. So think maybe, giving him the benefit of the doubt, maybe he had 1,000 followers in the world, right? People who wanted to conduct attacks against the West, right? Not against just local targets. Today, there's probably 16, 17, 18,000 people around the world, from West Africa to East Africa to the Middle East to South Asia to Southeast Asia, who don't just want to conduct attacks against local targets like extremists have for decades, but they want to attack the West, and they want to attack the symbols of the modern world and globalization, et cetera. So from that perspective, he's created quite a movement, right? And I think the other thing he would think is that he weakened the United States, right? One of the things that gave him the idea to do this was the success of the Afghan freedom fighters against the Soviet Union, then the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. And could he do the same thing to the United States? Well, he hasn't created the collapse of the United States, but I think he would look at us domestically. I think he would look at us in the world and say, boy, did I weaken them. So I think if he were alive, he would say, my movement's doing pretty well. And for me, this is long term, right? 20 years is a very short period of time here in the way I'm thinking about what I'm trying to achieve.
It sort of reminds me of the old line that Zhou Enlai was asked about the French Revolution. And he said, well, it's too soon to tell. And in some ways, a lot of these questions are still live matters.
Right, the interesting question about the U.S. and the Middle East, right? Which is one of the things he wanted.
Well, let's talk about that, actually. I mean, but I'm curious, Farah, what do you make of that sort of balance sheet that we were just talking about?
Well, one of the things that is very clear is that he unleashed something far bigger than anyone could have imagined, right? This isn't, we lost 3,000 human lives on 9/11 from 93 different countries. That is devastating. It's a horrible statistic. But over the course of the last 20 years, he has unraveled things that we did not expect him to unravel. Issues around identity, issues around belonging, issues within the United States on who we are, what our red lines are, who we think we are. We have exposed societal sinkholes. We have seen the power of an ideology turn us inside out. There's a direct line between what happened on 9/11 and what happened on 1/6. And we have also seen, frankly, the disruption of the way in which coalitions are built and formed, where our money goes and how we think about it, where the movement is today is so much bigger than we ever imagined. We were measuring it by how many cells. How dangerous is it? What could happen? When the Boston bombing happened on Boylston Street in Massachusetts, we were thinking about sort of the aftermath of that ideology, but I think about it in a much bigger way. Today, when I think about the power of that ideology to recruit globally, we know that ideology has no borders. This isn't about what's happening in Asia versus what's happening in the Middle East versus what's happening in Africa. The power of ISIS to be able to take something and someone from Trinidad and Tobago and move them into fight for the so-called caliphate in the Middle East is a very powerful device. You're hitting the emotional core, you're hitting the psychological core, and you're looking at the time, it was millennials. Now it's Gen Z, and it soon will be Gen Alpha that extremists are trying to recruit. And when I say extremists, I don't mean the kind that are only using Islam and manipulating Islam. I also mean the neo-Nazis. I also mean, all of the other things that we've seen as an aftermath. When Mike said, when you look at the world and you could take a snapshot of where the cells were, we've had terrorism for thousands of, this is nothing new. Of course people are going to fight political and other things. But what is new is the capturing of both the technology revolution, the ability with a swish of your finger to go down a rabbit hole, the power and the persuasion of making you ask yourself, who am I? That is the power of bin Laden. To me, this is not an easy thing to unpack because it has exposed us as humans and the way societies have acted, and it has also exposed, frankly, where governments have put their energy on what they're fighting. Because if in fact we did successfully protect ourselves, and that we need to celebrate. But all of our resources and focus have been on making sure, quote, another 9/11 doesn't happen. And I ask myself the question, if we had equally gone after bin Laden, taken him out at the same time that we were smart enough to understand the cultural impact of what was going to happen, we would be in a very different place today. And that's really the devastation for me as I think about 9/11, because I now look at the students in the audience and the world that they have inherited and what is going to happen because of these evil ideologies that are moving us forward. We aren't able, we have failed at looking around the corner. We cannot forecast, we do not know what we're doing on the cultural side, and that presents a very dangerous threat environment that Al-Qaeda did unleash, but we're now looking at the aftermath in a new way.
The question of what was unleashed versus what was exposed or what was already building is a fascinating one. And Ben, you get at this recently in some of your writing. You made the point that one of the things that happened after 9/11 is that there was, as you put it, a blurring of the distinction between critics and enemies, and that became a defining feature, really, of our politics. And I'm curious about why that is, I think, a hugely important piece of drawing the connection that you just made, Farah, between 9/11 and the culture around January 6th. The idea that criticism actually sort of became part of a binary choice. You were either with us or against us, and that applies in domestic politics as well. How do you think about that question of where that blurring happened? And why was it that 9/11 did it? Why was it not that Oklahoma City in 1995? What was it about the legacy of that moment that created this pernicious turn in our political culture, do you think?
So, reflecting on this, in my own life, and I do this a lot in my book, but the unifying sense of purpose that the United States had in the Cold War kind of contributed to a sense of national identity, certainly kind of defined what our purpose was in the world, and also kind of set some guardrails around, you probably don't have a Trump as president when you're worried about a potential nuclear war with the Soviet Union, And I felt acutely in the 90s the absence of an agreed upon sense of common identity and purpose in the United States. And I think what happened after 9/11 that was so powerful and went so beyond probably what George Bush even thought he was doing is, number one, you have just a massive things done. I mean, being in government, when the period of time between 9/11 and the Iraq War, that window, the decision to make Afghanistan about nation building, the decision to invade Iraq, the decision to utilize really extrajudicial methods in the war on terror, the decision to kind of remake the whole US government, there's nothing inevitable about that. I mean, we could have just sent a few hundred guys to Afghanistan and brought them back. Like that, these were massive things that ended up driving trillions of dollars in spending and focus, and we're not doing other things in that time. We're not doing climate change, et cetera. But so he also, in addition, behind that, marshaled, I think, American identity. If you go back and look at those speeches, which I found very kind of stirring at the time, he's comparing the war on terror to the World War II and the Cold War. The deepest chords of American identity, he is striking. Like we're in this, And politically, it was hugely successful. And there was, I think, one of the most important elections in my lifetime was the 2002 midterm election, where they kind of bludgeoned the Democrats as being insufficiently committed to this project.
Right.
Win big, and that's right around the Iraq War vote. And this is around the time that I think, whether or not they intended to or not, there was something unleashed. There was a kind of xenophobic current that's always been here, but suddenly it's on TV every day. You turn on Fox or talk radio and things like this, people are being stirred up and being promised big victories. This is going to be like World War II. We're going to go over there. We're going to vanquish them. They're going to be the dustbin of history like these other people we beat. And you ask why it's different? The people who did this are brown.
Yeah.
And they worship a different God. They're not white. They're not Christian. Timothy McVeigh, we learn about, what happened in his childhood that explains this. Nobody tries to understand, what explains this when it's brown people. And I think what happened is it unleashed a current in American politics that is very dangerous. And frankly, as the time passed and the great victories didn't materialize, what do you do? If you're orchestrating kind of the machinery of, to just be blunt, I know I have a partisan perspective here, but right-wing media in this country, it morphs from the terrorists, the people who want to bring Sharia law to the US. But in the Obama years, you swap in the black president, the immigrants at the southern border, the kneeling black athletes, this idea that there's an other to be afraid of, and that we are defining our identity as Americans in opposition to this other that represents something different than what is truly American. I think that becomes the defining aspect of our politics. And we are in a contest over what it means to be American in a way that goes far beyond 9/11, but I think has very deep roots in 9/11 and is impossible without it. And frankly, is connected to this same identity stuff is happening everywhere, right? As Farah noted, but like there's a backlash to globalization that manifests itself in Putin and in far-right parties and ISIS. It's, we're dealing with one strain, but here, I think 9/11 is the thing that really, ignited what has always been present underneath the surface in American culture and politics, and it kind of gradually normalized it and it expanded such that by the time we get 20 years out, the same people that would have been cheerleading the guy in the Howard Stern
Right.
anecdote, that guy's in January 6th.
That's right.
You know, that guy's, the real war is not with Al-Qaeda. The real war is actually here at home.
There is this amazing lineage that you can begin to track in retrospect. I mean, one of the things I was doing in this book was trying to understand those nodes, the points along the way. And one thing you see happen is that the language around fear of Islam almost morphs, almost in an unannounced way, into this generalized fear of immigration. And there are these people that have been sort of forgotten to political history, these figures, minor congressmen, who that was their thing. They made that move, that merger, and they sort of set in motion a lot of what we're dealing with, I think, today. We're going to go to questions in just a few minutes, so begin to think about what it is you may want to ask our folks up here. But before we do, I want to ask each of our panelists, what do you think, as you think back on the threats that we've encountered over the last 20 years, foreign and domestic, to use the immortal phrase, where do you think we underestimated the threat, and where do you think we overestimated the threat to this country? Michael, you've worked in national security. You've thought about this from every angle. How do you take on that question? Where do you think we underestimated it and overestimated it?
Well, I'd start by saying, we overreacted. As a national security community, we overreacted to 9/11. And nobody should be surprised by that, given what happened, right? It's like gang members trying to break into your house and kill your family. You're going to do whatever it takes, right? And you're probably going to do more than it takes. And you're not going to think about, what created these guys in the first place and how do I solve, the fundamental conditions that created the situation, right? You're just going to do what you need to do. And that's what we did. At CIA, we moved resources like we'd never moved them before to counterterrorism. And then we got a budget increase 4 times, what we had beforehand. And all that went to counterterrorism. And we ended up underestimating everything else. Literally everything else. And so today, geopolitically, we are in a much weaker position because of it. I think about Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, and the intelligence community, because of the resources that it moved from different parts of the world to counterterrorism, because of that, we could not tell President Bush where the Russian army was. Isn't that remarkable?
That's amazing.
Isn't that remarkable? And because we spent 20 years fighting a counterterrorism and counterinsurgency war, the Russians and the Chinese had a free 20 years to focus on us. They had a free 20 years to invest in conventional weapons to fight us. And they figured out how we fought wars, and they developed the weapon systems to prevent us from fighting that way. So, the last National Defense Strategy Commission unanimously concluded that because of the last 20 years and the way they've played out, that if we had to fight a war today against Russia in its backyard or China in its backyard, we would struggle to win and could well lose that war. So if the Chinese moved tomorrow against Taiwan, it would be a tough decision by the president whether to come to Taiwan's aid or not, because we could well lose, right? So we're in a much worse position. The question is, did we overestimate the threat from Al-Qaeda? And I think initially probably not, because they did have plans for a second wave of attacks against the United States. They were trying to get their hands on nuclear weapons. But I think as the years played out and as they were weakened over a period of time, we should have eased back on the threat assessments, right? And talked more about the threats in other places. And the last thing I'll say, and then turn it over to my colleagues here, is that when I get asked about what's the biggest threat to America, I talk about our own politics, right? Because our national security can't be strong without a strong American economy and a strong American society. So at the end of the day, it comes back to our politics, and we clearly didn't spend enough time, focused on issues that mattered here at home.
and that shifting of resources you described extend across government agencies. I was struck to find that even the IRS, for instance, moved so many of its people into counterterrorism that they stopped auditing people who were doing tax evasion, which then ultimately led to some of the populist fury that we see today around tax avoidance and the fact that people really kills us that there is so much that goes uncollected by the Treasury. Yeah. Farah, over to you. Same question. What do you think, overestimated and underestimated?
Well, I do want to say, just to follow up on what Ben was saying about what it unleashed with regard, and is connected, what it unleashed in terms of the other, and the increase of fear, and the increase of distrust for government, for your fellow citizen, for corporations. This is part of what I meant when I said it unleashed all kinds of things. And we underestimated the impact of what that meant for American Muslims. Let me be really clear. There was a life before 9/11, and there's a life after 9/11. And for the students here who grew up in a post-9/11 world, you cannot imagine that you could be an American Muslim and not be asked about your faith, about your heritage, or who bin Laden was. It actually happened that you could live your life and no one would ask you any of these questions. Today, 7-year-old kids are being asked by their teachers to explain to the class who bin Laden is and what Islam is all about. It is unacceptable. But this is what this is the impact for a very small minority in America, but it has had an impact on anybody that is not white. So you talk to anybody of color, whatever that might mean, and you will hear the conversations of worry about security, fear for family, displacement, the emotional impact of what it means to love a country that doesn't love you back. The idea that you can be in a class, can be at a restaurant, can be anywhere, and be asked questions that are increasingly and over-personal because of the way they perceive you, because you might have a turban on your head, you might have a bindi on your forehead, you might wear, whatever it is, that is an extremely important component to this aftermath of what it might mean. And it obviously didn't just happen here in America, it happened around the world. When I think about the underestimation and the overestimation, we in policy, eyes glaze over when you talk about culture. No one wants to hear about emotional and psychological impact of what it might mean to societies. Give me a break. How do you handle that? What do you do? What's the policy for that? But in fact, we didn't estimate the impact it was going to have, not just on our American citizens, but on our Sikh brothers and sisters, on our Hindu brothers and sisters, on our Black brothers, and whatever it is. It changed the feeling of what it meant to be American and to belong. So that underestimation may seem like that's not a national security thing, but it is. Because insecurity within our own nation, the tearing apart of communities, is central to the strength of who we are as a nation, and our enemies know it. There is a reason why terrorist organizations and extremists of all kinds use social media platforms to sow that kind of distrust between heritages, religions. They're doing it actively because it makes us weaker. I think that I would also say one last thing. I think one of the biggest weaknesses, even though we stood up, as Ben rightly said, we did a lot in a very short period of time in standing up a Department of Homeland Security, the NCTC, they could go on. Here's what we didn't do. America, I would argue, has the best intelligence operation anywhere in the world. We have missed cultural intelligence. We cannot be predictive. We're very good at this in business. We can tell you what the next fad is going to be. We can tell you how to connect the dots. American foreign policy establishment cannot connect the dots on emotional and cultural things that will in fact impact both politics and that will make a difference to the way what we support money to go towards and how we think about a particular thing. If we were to do one thing right now, if I were to walk
Yeah.
in and have a little magic wand, it would be to put money into the cultural intelligence component of our operation. Because in order for us, one of the things that I learned firsthand when I was special representative to Muslim communities was that because we so compartmentalize regions, we don't see that something that's happening in Tajikistan actually is connected to what's happening in Nouakchott, Mauritania. We think that they're different regions, they're a different part of the State Department, they're different, like it doesn't connect. But as I said earlier, ideology has no borders. And so you have to be able to understand that what might happen in Portland, Oregon is in fact going to connect to something that is happening in Berlin. And we've got to be more savvy about it. So in terms of how we organize ourselves, I think it's a great question to ask, what didn't we know and what should we, but we have a moment today to fix that. And that's where I'm hoping that some of these lessons and these black holes that we did not fill get filled now, because I agree with you. I think the future, Mike, is more dangerous than we could have ever have predicted.
Well said.
Look, I would think sometimes when I was in the U.S. government that if somebody came down from like outer space with a management consultancy,
it's a very
and was
specific
like-
type of alien.
yeah, and this alien comes down, they don't know anything, and they're like, okay, these are the most powerful people, most powerful country in the world, and they've got climate change is happening on their planet. Technology is kind of totally transforming the way people live, work, communicate. You got this country with a radically different political system and social organization in China with over 1 billion people that is preparing to kind of test whether or not liberal democracy itself can survive in a 21st century of technology and globalization. And they're spending trillions of dollars in fighting endless wars in a handful of small to medium-sized countries in the Middle East to try to kill a few thousand people and prevent attacks into the United States that are a tiny, tiny fraction of the people that they allow to be killed every year with guns in their culture. You wouldn't build this national security apparatus. It was, and what was so interesting is, I think in the second Obama term, we really did try to change this, and it was like, we are going to make climate change a top priority to get to a Paris Agreement. We are going to make this pivot to Asia. We're going to have a nuclear deal with Iran to avoid having to fight another war in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. That was the most controversial stuff we did.
Yeah.
Like when this all seems obvious now at the 20-year panel, the Afghan surge, there was like nobody was against that in official Washington, right? Like all the pressure, like our politics were built to just be wrong about stuff. And the incentive was to only overreact to terrorism. And we had, when Michael and I were in the Situation Room, like, a guy gets on an airplane, and I know I'm going to sound like I'm minimizing, I'm not, because if he blew up the airplane, it would have been terrible, but he succeeds only in lighting his underwear on fire. And that's who was hurt by that event. And it was like a multi-week political crisis, like Obama's taking huge hits, people are calling for like new extrajudicial military prison, Lindsey Graham wants to personally build a new prison in Cuba to put this guy in, and like, this is insane. We've indulged insanity. Like this is not like a close call. Like, and here's the thing: like terrorism is real, but here's the thing: like there are people like Michael. We have intelligence and law enforcement. We have a capacity to deal with this without this insane mindset of zero tolerance. I mean, part of it is just accepting that there might be a terrorist attack in this country, and that's not the end of the world. Particularly if it's nowhere near the scale of 9/11. Like, so it's not that there's no threat. It's that given everything else that's happening, like, I remember we went to Paris to negotiate the Paris Accords, and people were asking me questions in the press, like, what's a bigger threat, ISIS or climate change? Like, it's a big gotcha question.
Right.
They want me to say climate change so that then there can be a cable news debate for 5 days in which Lindsey Graham lights himself on fire and says they don't get it.
And it says
But look,
Democratic squish thinks climate change
the
bigger
Democratic weenie liberal guy thinks
Yeah.
climate change is more important than terrorism. Well, of course it is.
Yeah.
One thing can destroy the entire planet and condemn everybody in this room to a dark and dystopian future where their dreams cannot be realized. One is a threat where some guy might get in, and the worst thing that happens is on par with the kind of mass shooting that this country lives with, like it's nothing. So we have to make a much more kind of fundamental shift here, and because of that question. Because any analysis of what is being underweighted and overweighted would find that even if you take terrorism deadly seriously, as I know Michael did every single day, because your lives are at stake. So I'm not saying that's not a threat. I'm just saying relative to everything else that's going on in the world, it's time to reorient our priorities here.
We are going to open this up now to questions from all of you. And we, of course, want to remind you that we prioritize student questions too, but you've got microphones set up. I think we've got a microphone right here in the middle. And I've also been asked to remind you that we'll ask women and men to alternate their questions. And we're going to have, we've got some time to do it. So let's plunge right in. We'll go with the first question right there at the microphone.
Good Lord.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name's Aya Hamza. I'm a first year here at UChicago College. I was really excited to see that there was a panel on 9/11 being discussed in the IOP, especially my second week being here. Although I can't share in on the jarring experiences you all have on the day of 9/11, my surname is actually my grandfather's name, and knowing that at the hospital, my father's last name was Hussein, they were afraid to pass it on to me given what could, be done to me or just general fear. And I'm incredibly interested in government and foreign policy, and that's what I've spent about the past 5 years really invested in. So as somebody who's very personally, as Farah mentioned, is having my political and personal identities intertwine, going into potentially a career in foreign policy, how do you think I could best use my position to create tangible change? Thank you in advance.
I'd like to celebrate the fact, by the way, that you can be President of the United States with the middle name Hussein. So we're counting on you, and I hope you'll do it. Farah, I thought you might have thoughts on that.
Yeah, first of all, I really encourage you to come into public service. It is the greatest honor of your life to be able to serve a country that you love. And it is, I think all of us will tell you, even though it's complex and challenging, it is extremely rewarding. With regard to your your question, on identity, listen, things are changing a lot because we're actually talking about it. I know that that's not everything, but it is something quite real. When I joined in government right out of college in 1990 for 3 years before I went to graduate school, we were not talking about race, ethnicity, sexuality, any of these things that make all of us so unique. And then 9/11 happened, and it transformed something very powerful inside of government, which asked the question, who do we have around the policy tables? Do we have more, can we get more diversity? So my answer to you is not to say, own whatever part of your identity that you want to put forward, but to use all of the components of your identity that make you sharp and brilliant and smart and creative in the way in which you answer questions. That is going to help not just you, but it's going to help our country in solving problems in a wonderful way.
Thank you so much.
Good evening. Sergi, and I'm a graduate student here at the Committee on International Relations. And my question goes like this. Obviously, we cannot negotiate with terrorists. That is understandable, quite understandable. But there was a comment that Director Morrell made at the end, your last comment, namely that the immediate surge to fight terrorism prevented thinking about a bigger picture. And there was also this comment about emotional intelligence that you referred to in terms of understanding better the cultural emotional intelligence. So my question goes like this. Director Morrell, how would you actually make peace with Al-Qaeda? What could be the path to peace, de-radicalization of those people, not giving up to them, obviously, but really making them not hate America anymore? Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't know. Look, some countries in the world have done a pretty good job with de-radicalization programs in the Middle East. I don't know exactly how those programs work. Maybe others up here do. But I will say this. Probably 10 years ago, there was a great Israeli documentary called The Gatekeepers. And it was interviews with every single living former director of Shin Bet, the Israeli Internal Security Service, whose job it was to protect Israel from terrorism. And for the first 45 minutes, they all talked about the extraordinary things they did, extrajudicial things they did to protect Israel from terrorists. The last 15 minutes was every single one of them complaining about their government for not coming to a political settlement with the Palestinians, because as fast as they took terrorists off the battlefield, more terrorists were coming on. I felt exactly the same way when I was at CIA. Right? That our job in the intelligence community and the military was to remove guys from the battlefield, but as fast as we did that, more and more of them were coming. And there were very few people in the world, there were some, but there were very few people in the world with very few resources dedicated to them to try to get to the cause of extremism in the first place and get to the underlying reasons why it happens. And I found that deeply frustrating.
Anybody want to add, or should we go on?
I'd add one thing, just real quick, which is, look, one thing I would say is that the United States, you know, I totally agree with Mike about the needing to look at this from your enemy's perspective. And, you know, if you actually really go and dig into what those guys were talking about, you know, before 9/11, it was largely America's support for these autocratic regimes in the Middle East. Now, the fact that they think that that was bad, that we did that, is not a reason to kind of stubbornly support them because they don't like that. I tell a story in the book about a guy named Mohammed Sultan, who's an Egyptian American who moves to Egypt after Tahrir Square to be part of the change there. After the military coup in 2013, he's shot, he's imprisoned, he's tortured. He is in a cell, and they put an ISIS recruiter in his cell. And he's on a hunger strike, and he has a debate with this ISIS recruiter about whether or not nonviolent resistance is better than violent resistance. So talk about an interesting scene. And the reason I say this is that our support for, our blank check of support are the billions of dollars we shovel out the door, or the arms sales we make to the very autocratic regimes that are fueling the grievances inside of these societies. I don't know the exact answer like Mike, but I do know that we can't expect the rest of the world to ignore this massive hypocrisy running straight down the middle between what we say we are and what we do in the world. And so, you know, I don't claim this is easy, and we have a lot of tough meetings on Egypt, but I do think that there's no solution in the long term that doesn't involve America figuring out a way to not have a mindset that says we're so afraid of everybody in your country that we're going to support what we know is a brutal dictatorship over actually trying to build relationships with the people that actually live in those countries, not the people who rule over them and frankly need them to be radicalized, because the radicalization, that's why there's an ISIS recruiter in there, because that justifies the billions of dollars in assistance that Egypt gets. That justifies why they're repressing people. So a component of this, I think, has to be America weaning itself off our kind of autocratic habit in the Middle East.
We are going to have a couple of questions at once, if you could, because we're going to have to try to get through this line. I want to make sure everybody has a chance. So if you can, go ahead. We'll try to keep it concise, everybody, and get as many questions as we possibly can. Over to you.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Norma. I'm a third year in the college. We started this panel with each of y'all sharing your personal stories regarding 9/11. I was a couple months old at 9/11 when it happened. This obviously was a very deeply disturbing event, and it really affected y'all in terms of your trajectories and your careers and the trajectory of the country. But for people like us who are starting to move into our professional careers, do you think that this will affect the way that we conduct politics, or do you think that the effects of 9/11 will become like a remnant of the past?
Interesting question.
One example of the autocrats that America enabled to secure itself from terrorism was Saddam Hussein. And so one could imagine an alternative history where after overthrowing the Saddam regime, the Iraqi army was not disbanded, the Ba'athist, the whole government wasn't disbanded, and the United States kept law and order as an occupying power was required to do. Rumsfeld famously said, "We don't do nation building." So one could imagine an intelligent way, smart government way to take nation building seriously, so that it wasn't that we did nation building and failed. It was that we didn't really do nation building.
We'll take one third one, in the interest of time. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Olivia. I'm a current second year in the college. Thank you all so much for being here. Farah, you had spoken a lot about the ways in which we define extremism and the ways they take form. And something I think a lot about is the polarization that I experience as a young person in this country every day. And the way in which you were defining extremism really made me reflect on what the relationship between these two ideals might be, and the rise in polarization, and also the way extremism has really had a presence in our country. So I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Do you want to take that first, and then we'll go in reverse order?
Sure. I want to just take a step back on this. What we have learned in 20 years is that radicalization doesn't happen on a whim. It's not, oh, I hated Bush's policy on this, and I hated what Obama did on that, and I hated what Trump, and boom, you're radicalized. Something is happening inside of you. You don't go online to ask Sheikh Google a question if something isn't happening inside of you. Identity and belonging is at the center, and everything comes from it, okay? And so when I think about this question about what do we do, the first question that was asked on how do we build and how do we think differently about AQ and other organizations like it, it is to go at the heart of what you're saying about asking yourself how you fit into society, how society thinks of you, how you're building bridges with each other. One of the great joys that I can report after 20 years of being in this is that there is more collective action today by societies, communities around America and the world that says we aren't going to be defined by one particular silo of how we need to be as a woman, as a Muslim, as a Jew, as a this. We have the capacity to think in a diverse way about how we think about things. Why is that important? That's important because the bad guys, whoever they are, whether it's a neo-Nazi, whether it is the Taliban, whoever it is, wants you to believe that there's a singular way to be, right? So the polarization that is happening in our country today around what is a real American, what is not a real American, what it means to be an abiding law, enforcing citizen that does this is very narrow. What I would say to you as you think about the parallels about all of this is that what's happening within communities around identity and belonging, around how we think about the other, are the central solutions to how we fix this problem. And solutions are available and affordable right now. It doesn't come from government alone. It comes from all of us, every single one of us.
We're going to take three more, and then our team can do a grab bag of what they want to answer, but I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to voice their question. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Jack Capizzi. I'm a fourth year in the college, and my question is about how we can be, as students whose lives have been bookmarked now by 9/11 and the pandemic. Mr. Morell, you said 20 years seems like a short period of time, but it is our entire lives. How can we have any faith in the institutions that you all have been a part of when it seems like so regularly promises are being made for our security, but people seem more and more fearful by the day? Thank you.
Hi, I'm a second year in the college. My name is Amina. And firstly, I want to say thank you so much. It really is an honor to get to ask you guys questions about your experiences. So my question's more directed towards Farah, and you were talking about how the Islamic narrative completely changed after 9/11. And I wasn't old enough to experience it, but my parents, both of them were Muslim, and they were living in Boston, actually, and working there and studying there. And they always tell me about how in 24 hours, everything changed socially, culturally, in every way. And you spoke about how you work to break that narrative. So I wanted to ask if you could talk a bit more about that. And would you say that the narrative is broken today? And how can someone like me, who's also Muslim and loves the US, because I don't think people understand that even though there was an an Islam versus American narrative, there was also an Islam versus Al-Qaeda narrative. So how does someone like me work to break that narrative, and how have you done that? Thank you.
We'll take one more, and then we'll see if there's some common threads, and we can address them up together.
Hi, my name is Graham. I'm a first-year student at the Harris School of Public Policy. So particularly for Mike and Ben, in recent years, there's been a certain amount of politicization of particularly congressional hearings. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on if there was a statutory or constitutional amendment we could do to try to decrease the amount of politicization that happens during these types of things and to limit the politicization of the intelligence community.
So you want to take that question, or do you want to identify something else that you want to respond?
Yeah, actually, I want to link the Iraq question
Right.
with the question about confidence in institutions. There was not a better way to have done Iraq. Iraq was the single biggest strategic mistake that I've ever seen in American foreign policy. That's a strong statement, but I really believe it. It was the defining. It was the defining example of our overreaction to 9/11.
Can you? I can't let you go without a brief question on how do you think we made the biggest strategic mistake? Like, how did that happen?
So I think
there's
two things that happened. I think one was intelligence community judgment that he had weapons of mass destruction and, was building those programs, right? And we were dead wrong. And the only thing I can tell you about the analysts who got the judgment wrong, right, who overestimated the threat significantly, we're living in a world inside the CIA in which the CIA felt deep, deep guilt about not having stopped 9/11 and felt deep, deep anger about being blamed for 9/11. And so don't be surprised that analysts are going to overestimate a threat in the direct aftermath of that, right? So that's one. And the other was, I think, President Bush, right, doing anything he could to prevent another 9/11. I mean, he felt deeply that his first responsibility was to protect the American people, and here he had failed on 9/11 to do his fundamental job. That's the way he thought about it. He talked to me about that. And I think that's what drove him more than anything else. He was afraid of Iraq doing something to us and not having acted to prevent it. But it was a huge mistake. And I think one of the many, many, many consequences was a loss of confidence on the part of the American people in the American government, right? And when I think about what just happened on Afghanistan, look, I agree 100% with President Biden's decision that we leave, 100%. How we left was a disaster. It was a debacle. And my biggest concern about that is it's going to lead even more people to question the capacity of our government to do its fundamental work. And I worry about the political impact of that here at home over the long term.
Ben, do you want to respond to anything that was raised?
Yeah. There are a couple of questions. The one that hit on institutions. I think the one that hit on what does 9/11 mean for me, to kind of speak to the relatively negative tenor of this conversation.
But we're ending on a happy note.
That's what I'm going to do.
We just haven't gotten there
That's
yet.
about what I'm going to do here, guys. I'm winding up, okay? And look, here's the thing. First of all, here's something I learned as someone who was once a 23-year-old city council campaign worker, totally linked to where your guys' experience is, and then was in the White House a few years later. Like, all of these institutions, they're human enterprises. There's not like some Wizard of Oz somewhere that's making sure that they run okay. And they reflect the complexity of human experience. And that means, and look, we've focused on a lot of negative things. A lot of good things have happened in the world the last 20 years, and a lot of positive ripples have been sent out from things that the US government has done or things that individuals in the US government have done. And the thing is, if you don't like the human institutions, well, the only way that they're going to change is if you become a part of those institutions and change them, or you become a part of some movement on the outside that puts the pressure on them that changes them. That's it. There's no other way that anything evolves and changes for the better. And the thing is, that can happen. And one of the things why I do think this is a hopeful moment is because, like I was saying, 10 years ago, this conversation, like I'd get permanently, voted off the island of whatever, Wizard of Oz does decide who's a part of these conversations. This is normal now. Like, people know. Mm-hmm. Like, we're starting from something, not a blank slate, but we have to move in radically different directions. And you guys get to figure out what those directions are. Like, I'm jealous of you guys for being able to have that opportunity. Now granted, you've got a bunch of nutcases who are trying to burn down the whole republic at the same time. That's not great.
Hold on, we were at a happy note for a minute. Then we got the nutcases.
But seriously, like, in terms of how 9/11 will impact it, I do believe in intergenerational trauma in individuals and families, and in countries, and in institutions. Like Mike just said, every institution of the government has been traumatized in some way by 9/11 and its response. But I do think right now you get a sense of a much greater openness to, well, what does it mean to have an entire foreign policy that has a climate change at its center? What does it mean to really, really, truly engage the question of democracy versus autocracy and the ways in which that intersects, because I agree, it entirely intersects with the crisis of identity, not just in this country, but in every country in the world. People are trying to figure out how to live in globalization, and they're still looking for that answer. So the optimistic note, without sugarcoating it, is precisely because like so much has gone wrong. Precisely because the overreaction is now inviting like a grasp for where's the solid ground underneath our feet. Like, your guys' generation are the ones who are going to be able to figure this out and have the benefit of learning from what went right and what went wrong before you. And I think the fact that these are much more diverse conversations, and I don't just mean gender and ethnicity, I mean point of view across the board, is one of the most hopeful things that's happening in our society. And frankly, as someone who worked for Barack Obama, is like, the more important part of his legacy than any national security policy had is just this kind of sense of broadening the conversation and the inclusivity around it. So to me, there's a lot to be hopeful about, and it's not disconnected from the things that went wrong.
Hear, hear. And the wisdom and the humanity that we've heard from this stage tonight is a credit to all the hard thinking that's gone into it. I'm now going to turn over to our fearless leader, David Axelrod, who's going to close us out.
Only because you can't sufficiently thank yourself. There is so much wisdom on this platform, and I know all of them and respect them so much. And one of the reasons the Institute of Politics is what it is because people like these are willing to share the benefit of their experience and their insights. And we're just so lucky and so grateful. And Evan, just a wonderful job of moderating this discussion. And thank you all for your questions, your insightful questions. I hope that you'll come back again and again and again. And I just want to point out that, first of all, every one of these people are accomplished authors, including Michael and Farah. These guys happen to have new books out, and so they're on sale over there. Wildland, The Making of America's Fury.
It's a hopeful day.
It does have a hopeful ending.
It does.
And after the fall, Being American in the World We Made by Ben Rhodes. If you liked the insights that you heard on this platform, read these books. They're really, really wonderful. I've read them both. Had a chance to talk with them both about them. They're on sale over there. I believe they're signed. The most important thing is come back again and again and again. As Ben said, we're only going to solve these problems with you, and you're going to inherit the world that results. So our investment is in you as leaders and as citizens, and we humbly share whatever we can, knowing that you can do better than we did. So thank you so much for being here tonight. We'll see you next time.